The sound reached Elias Thorne through the cabin walls like the scraping of fingernails against wood, rhythmic, desperate, wrong. He jerked awake in the chair where he'd been dozing, the empty whiskey bottle rolling from his lap to shatter against the stone hearth. The fire had died to embers, casting the room in a hellish orange glow that made the shadows dance like specters. Scrape, scrape, scrape. 3 days had passed since they'd lowered Elara into the frozen ground of Willowbrook Cemetery. 3 days since the preacher's hollow words had echoed across the windswept prairie. 3 days of neighbors bringing casseroles he couldn't taste and offering condolences that fell on ears deafened by grief. But this sound, this wasn't the wind or settling timber or his own fractured mind playing tricks. Elias stumbled to the window, his legs unsteady from grief and drink. The November night pressed against the glass like black velvet, but there, in the pale moonlight filtering through storm clouds, he saw her. Willow, Elara's beloved Palomino More, stood at the edge of the cemetery beyond the pasture fence. Even at this distance, he could see the frantic motion of her front hooves, the earth flying up in dark clods around her legs. What in God's name? The words died in his throat as understanding crashed over him like ice water. The horse was digging. At Elara's grave, Elias grabbed his coat and lantern, his hands shaking as he lit the wick. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside, but he barely felt it. His boots crunched through the frost-brittle grass as he made his way toward the cemetery, the lantern's yellow circle of light bobbing with each step. The sight that greeted him defied comprehension. Willow had managed to scrape away nearly 2 feet of earth from the grave's head, her hooves bloody and raw, her golden coat dark with sweat despite the bitter cold. Her eyes rolled white in the lantern light, but she didn't stop, didn't even acknowledge his presence. She dug with a ferocity that seemed to come from some primal place beyond reason or exhaustion. "Willow girl, what are you doing?" Elias reached for her bridle, but she snapped at him, her teeth bared before returning to her frantic excavation. Foam flecked her muzzle, and her breathing came in harsh, visible puffs in the frigid air. For a moment, Elias stood transfixed. The Mare had always been gentle, docile even, responding to Elara's lightest touch with an almost supernatural understanding between woman and beast. But this creature before him bore no resemblance to that calm, intelligent animal. This was something wild, possessed, driven by an urgency that made his skin crawl. "Stop it!" He grabbed a handful of her mane, trying to pull her away from the grave. "Stop it right now!" Willow reared, her hooves pawing the air inches from his face, and for a terrifying moment he thought she might strike him down. But instead, she wheeled away from him and resumed digging, her efforts more frantic than before. As if his interference had only made her more desperate, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. He told himself it was just the dying flowers from the funeral, but deep in his bones, he knew better. Elias stood there in the darkness, watching his dead wife's horse tear at her grave with bloody hooves, and felt the first hairline crack appear. In his sanity, when dawn finally crept across the prairie, painting the sky the color of old bone, Elias managed to coax Willow away from the cemetery with a handful of oats. She came reluctantly, looking back at the disturbed earth with what could only be described as longing. He led her to the barn, noting how she favored her front hooves, the way she kept turning her head toward the graveyard, as if listening for something only she could hear back by the time Dr. Alistair Finch arrived that afternoon. Elias had managed to shower and change clothes, though he couldn't do anything about the hollow look in his eyes or the way his hands trembled when he poured the coffee. "Elias, my dear fellow," Dr. Finch said, settling his considerable bulk into the kitchen chair with practiced ease. "I came as soon as I received your message. You sounded quite distressed. Dr. Finch was a man who inspired confidence through sheer presence. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his beard trim and dignified, his dark eyes sharp with intelligence behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He'd delivered half the babies in the county and seen most of their grandparents to their final rest. If Dr. Finch said something was so, people believed it. "It's the horse," Elias began, then stopped, unsure how to explain what he'd witnessed, without sounding like a madman. "Willow's been acting strange since the funeral. Grief affects animals much as it does humans," Dr. Finch said, his voice carrying the warm authority of years of practice. "I've seen dogs refuse to eat after their masters pass, cats that howl for weeks. It's perfectly natural." She was digging at Ilara's grave. The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Dr. Finch's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes' surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Digging?" he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "All night. Her hooves are torn to pieces. She wouldn't stop, wouldn't come when I called. She was like something possessed." Elias leaned forward, desperate to make the doctor understand. "This isn't grief, doctor. This is something else entirely." Dr. Finch was quiet for a long moment, studying Elias with those sharp eyes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, professional, the tone one might use with a fractious child. "Elias, when did you last eat a proper meal? When did you last sleep in your bed instead of that chair by the fire?" The question caught Elias off guard. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "Answer me, please." Elias tried to remember. The days since the funeral had blurred together in a haze of whiskey and sorrow. It's been difficult to—" "Exactly." Dr. Finch leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic but firm. "You're exhausted, malnourished, and drowning in grief. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. What you think you saw, I know what I saw." The words exploded from Elias with more force than he'd intended. "That horse was digging at my wife's grave." "Of course you believe that," Dr. Finch said, his voice maddeningly calm. "But consider this. Willow was Ilara's constant companion. Perhaps she was simply visiting the grave, pawing at the ground the way horses do when they're anxious, or confused. In your current state of mind, such innocent behavior might seem far more sinister than it actually is." Elias stared at the doctor, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. Was it possible? Had grief so thoroughly warped his perception that he'd imagined the whole nightmarish scene? "I want you to take these," Dr. Finch said, producing a small, brown bottle from his medical bag. "Laudanum, just a few drops in water before bed. It will help you sleep properly, clear your head. And I'm going to have Mrs. Patterson from town come by with some proper meals. You need to take care of yourself, Elias. Ilara wouldn't want to see you destroying yourself like this." The mention of his wife's name hit Elias like a physical blow. He accepted the bottle with numb fingers, wanting desperately to believe that the doctor was right, that his grief had transformed a mourning animal into something monstrous. That night, after forcing down half of Mrs. Patterson's beef stew and taking the prescribed laudanum, Elias slept in his bed for the first time since the funeral. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, and when he woke to the pale light of dawn, he almost convinced himself that the previous night had been nothing more than a laudanum-induced nightmare dot until he looked out the bedroom window and saw Willow standing at the cemetery fence, her golden coat streaked with mud, her front hooves caked with fresh earth. The second night was worse than the first. The horse had somehow worked her way deeper into the grave, her efforts more focused, more purposeful. When Elias tried to approach her, she bared her teeth and struck out with her hooves, forcing him to keep his distance. The sweet, cloying smell was stronger now, mixing with the earthy scent of disturbed soil to create an odor that made his gorge rise. He called Dr. Finch again, then Sheriff Brody, desperate for someone to witness what he was seeing. But by the time they arrived, Willow had returned to the barn, leaving only the disturbed earth as evidence of her nocturnal activities. Animals will sometimes visit the graves of their companions, Sheriff Brody said, his weathered face creased with sympathy. My old dog used to lie on my pa's grave for hours after we buried him. She's not visiting, Elias insisted. She's digging. Look at the earth. Look at her hooves. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Dr. Finch, and Elias saw something pass between them, a look of shared concern that had nothing to do with the horse's strange behavior and everything to do with his own mental state. Elias, Dr. Finch said carefully, I think it might be best if we moved Willow to the Hendricks place for a while. Just until you've had time to? No. The word came out sharper than Elias intended. She was Alara's horse. She stays here. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. Was he protecting the horse, or was he protecting some delusion his grief-stricken mind had created? The line between reality and madness had become so blurred that he could no longer trust his own perceptions. The third night brought a storm that lashed the prairie with wind and freezing rain. Elias stood at his bedroom window, watching the lightning illuminate the cemetery in stark blue-white flashes. He'd taken a double dose of laudanum, desperate for sleep, but his eyes kept drifting to the graveyard, searching for movement in the darkness. When the lightning flashed again, he saw her. Willow stood beside Alara's grave, her head lowered, her front hooves working at the earth with mechanical precision. The rain had turned the disturbed soil to mud, but she kept digging, kept scraping, as if some invisible force compelled her to continue. Elias grabbed his coat and lantern, his movements clumsy from the laudanum, but driven by a growing sense of urgency. Something was wrong, more wrong than grief or madness could explain. The horse's behavior wasn't random or aimless. It was focused, purposeful, as if she knew something that he didn't. The storm hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside. Rain lashed his face, and the wind nearly tore the lantern from his grip. But he pressed on, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or understand. Willow didn't acknowledge his approach this time. She seemed lost in her work, her breath coming in harsh gasps that mixed with the wind. The hole she dug was deeper now, nearly 3 feet down, and lined with muddy claw marks that spoke of desperate, frantic effort. "What is it, girl?" Elias whispered, his voice lost in the storm. "What are you trying to tell me?" As if in answer to his question, a memory surfaced from the depths of his grief-clouded mind. Ilara's final day, when she'd complained of feeling dizzy and weak. Dr. Finch's house call, his gentle bedside manner as he examined her. The small brown bottle he'd left behind, filled with a tonic he'd said would help her rest. "I can't wake up," she'd whispered just before the end, her voice so faint he'd barely heard it. "Elias, I can't wake up." At the time, he'd thought it was the fever talking, the final delirious words of a dying woman. But now, watching Willow's desperate efforts, those words took on a different, more terrifying meaning. "I can't wake up. Not I'm dying. Not I'm going. But I can't wake up." The lantern slipped from his numb fingers, its light extinguished by the rain. In the darkness, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning, Elias knelt beside the horse and began to dig with his bare hands. When Sheriff Brody found them the next morning, Elias was unconscious beside the grave, his hands bloody and raw, his body nearly blue with cold. Willow stood over him like a sentinel, her eyes wild but watchful, as if she'd been guarding him through the night. "Jesus Christ, Elias," the sheriff muttered, wrapping a blanket around the semi-conscious man. "What the hell were you thinking?" "Doctor." Finch arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave with professional concern. He examined Elias with gentle efficiency, checking his pulse, looking into his eyes, speaking in the soothing tones reserved for the mentally unstable. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and what appears to be a complete psychotic break, he murmured to Sheriff Brody, just loud enough for Elias to hear. I'm afraid the grief has pushed him over the edge entirely. We need to consider hospitalization, perhaps the state asylum in Denver. No, Elias croaked, his voice barely audible. Not mad. Something wrong. Check the grave. Dr. Finch's expression grew even more sympathetic, if possible. My dear fellow, your wife died of a fever. I examined her myself, signed the death certificate. These fantasies you're creating, the tonic, Elias interrupted, struggling to focus through the fog of exhaustion and hypothermia. What was in the tonic you gave her? For just a moment, Dr. Finch's mask slipped. Something cold and calculating flickered behind his eyes before the concerned physician returned. A mild sedative to help her rest, he said smoothly. Nothing more. Elias, you're ill. You need help. But Elias had seen that flicker, that moment of something that wasn't quite right. With tremendous effort, he pulled himself to his feet, swaying but determined. Then you won't mind if we open the coffin, he said, his voice growing stronger. If I'm mad, if she's dead, what harm could it do? The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable. Dr. Finch's face had gone carefully. Blank and Willow had gone perfectly still, as if she too was waiting for an answer. That would be desecration of a grave, Dr. Finch said finally. A criminal act. Sheriff, surely you won't allow. I'll get a court order, Elias said, his mind suddenly clear for the first time in days. I'll get a lawyer. You'll do no such thing, Sheriff Brody said firmly. Elias, you're talking about digging up your wife's body based on the behavior of a grieving horse. That's not the thinking of a sane man. Elias looked from one man to the other, seeing in their faces the immovable wall of social convention and medical authority. They thought he was mad, and perhaps he was. Perhaps grief had finally broken his mind entirely. But as he looked at Willow, at the intelligence in her eyes, and the purposeful way she'd positioned herself beside the disturbed grave, he felt a certainty that went deeper than logic or reason. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. That night, alone in his cabin, with only the sound of wind and Willow's restless pacing for company, Elias made a decision that would either save his wife or damn his soul. He was going to dig up Ilara's grave. The decision brought with it a strange sort of peace, as if some great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He moved through the house like a man in a dream, gathering the things he would need: a shovel, a lantern, dry clothes for afterward. In the kitchen drawer, he found Ilara's journal, a leather-bound book where she'd recorded her thoughts about the ranch, the weather, the small daily miracles that had filled their life together. He'd avoided reading it since her death, afraid of the pain it would bring. But now, with trembling fingers, he opened it to the final entries. November 3rd, still feeling poorly. The dizziness comes and goes, and I find myself so terribly tired. Dr. Finch says it's just a winter fever, nothing to worry about. He's given me a tonic to help me rest. November 4th, the tonic makes me feel strange, like I'm floating outside my own body. Willow seems agitated when I'm near her. Animals know things, don't they? I found the most beautiful flower growing by the old well-purple blooms, shaped like little monk's hoods. I pressed one in this journal to remember. Elias's hands shook as he turned the page. There, pressed between the leaves of the journal, was a dried flower with deep purple petals, shaped exactly as Ilara had described. His blood ran cold as recognition hit him. Monk's hood, Aconitum napellus, a plant so poisonous that even touching it could cause paralysis and death. But in very small doses, carefully administered, it could slow the heart rate to almost nothing, create a death-like coma so convincing that even a trained physician might be fooled, especially if that physician knew exactly what to look for and what not to find. November 5th. I had the strangest dream last night. I dreamed that I was dead, but I could still hear and feel everything around me. I could hear Elias crying, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't tell him I was still here. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. When I woke up, Dr. Finch was here again. He says the fever is getting worse, but I don't feel feverish. I feel empty, cold, like something inside me is going to sleep and may never wake up. The journal entry ended there, but the implication was clear. Elara had known something was wrong, had sensed the trap closing around her, even as the poison slowly paralyzed her body. And Willow dear, faithful Willow, had somehow understood that her mistress wasn't truly gone. Elias closed the journal and looked out the window at the cemetery. The storm had passed, leaving the night clear and bitter cold. Perfect conditions for what he had to do. He dressed warmly, grabbed the shovel and lantern, and stepped out into the night. Willow was waiting for him by the barn, her reins hanging loose around her neck, as if she'd somehow freed herself from her stall. She fell into step beside him as they walked toward the cemetery, her presence both comforting and eerie in the moonlight. The grave looked like a wound in the earth, raw and ugly in the pale light. Elias lit the lantern and hung it from a nearby fence post, then picked up the shovel with hands that shook only slightly. If he was wrong, if grief and desperation had finally driven him completely mad, then by morning he would be either dead by his own hand or locked away in an asylum. But if he was right, if he was right, then Elara was still alive down there in the dark, trapped in a nightmare of paralysis and suffocation, waiting for someone to hear her silent screams. The first shovelful of earth came. Up easily Willow's efforts had already loosened much of the soil. The second and third followed, and soon Elias fell into a rhythm. Dig, lift, throw, dig, lift, throw. The work warmed him despite the cold, and sweat soon beaded on his forehead despite the freezing air. Willow stood beside the grave like a statue, never moving, never making a sound, just watching with those intelligent eyes as he dug deeper into the earth. Occasionally she would lower her head and nicker softly, as if encouraging him to continue. Time seemed to stop. There was only the scrape of the shovel against soil, the whisper of earth falling back into the hole, the rasp of his own breathing in the cold air. His back ached, his hands blistered, but he kept digging, driven by a desperation that bordered on madness. Finally, after what felt like hours, the shovel struck wood. The sound echoed through the night like a gunshot, and Elias froze. For a moment he stood paralyzed, staring down at the coffin that lay 6 feet below him. In the flickering lantern light, he could see the brass nameplate that read, Elara Marie Thorne, beloved wife. Beloved wife, who might still be alive down there in the dark. With shaking hands, Elias cleared the remaining dirt from the coffin lid. The wood was simple pine, stained dark with earth and moisture. He ran his fingers along the edges, looking for the latches that would open it, and found them corroded but still functional. He was about to commit an act that would brand him as either a hero or a madman, possibly both. There would be no going back from this moment, no pretending that grief had simply played tricks on his mind. Whatever lay inside that coffin would define the rest of his life. Elias grasped the nearest latch and pulled. The lid opened with a creak that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. Inside, lit by the flickering lantern light, lay Elara. But this wasn't the peaceful corpse he expected to find. Her hair was disheveled, her burial dress torn, and her hands gaued. Her hands were scratched and bloody, the nails broken from clawing at the coffin lid. Faint scratch marks scored the interior of the coffin, testament to her desperate attempts to escape her premature burial. And she was breathing. The movement was so slight that at first Elias thought it was a trick of the light. But no, her chest rose and fell in the barest whisper of respiration, so slow and shallow that it was almost imperceptible. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as wax, but unmistakably warm to the touch. Elara was alive. The paralysis that held Elias broke all at once. He dropped into the grave beside the coffin, gathering his wife's limp body in his arms. She was dead weight, completely unresponsive, but he could feel the faint flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers. "Elara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, Elara, I'm here. I'm here." Getting her out of the grave proved to be the most difficult thing he'd ever done. Her body was completely limp, and the walls of the grave were steep and muddy. But desperation gave him strength, and somehow he managed to lift her up to ground level, where Willow waited with what could only be described as satisfaction. The journey back to the house was a nightmare blur of stumbling steps and desperate prayers. Elara's breathing remained shallow and irregular, and her skin felt cold as marble despite the blankets he'd wrapped around her. More than once he thought he'd lost her entirely, only to feel the faint flutter of life return. He carried her to their bedroom and laid her on the bed, then set about trying to warm her body temperature. Hot water bottles, extra blankets, friction to stimulate circulation, all the things he'd learned from years of treating hypothermic cattle during harsh winters. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, some color began to return to her cheeks. Dawn was breaking over the prairie when the first sign of consciousness appeared. A slight flutter of her eyelids, so brief he almost missed it. Then another, stronger this time. Her lips moved soundlessly, and her fingers twitched against the blankets. "Elara?" Elias leaned over her, his heart hammering. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened just a crack at first, then wider as awareness gradually returned. They were unfocused, confused, but undeniably alive. Her lips moved again, and this time the faintest whisper emerged. "Cold, ... So cold." Elias felt tears streaming down his face as he pulled more blankets around her. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You're safe. I've got you." The sound of horses approaching interrupted the moment. Through the bedroom window, Elias could see Sheriff Brody and Dr. Finch riding up to the house, their faces grim with purpose. They'd come to arrest him for grave desecration, no doubt. What they would find instead would change everything. "Elias Thorne," Sheriff Brody's voice boomed across the yard. "Come out here. You're under arrest." Elias looked down at his wife, whose eyes were now focusing on his face with growing recognition. A faint smile touched her lips, the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll be right back." He walked out to meet them, his shoulders straight and his conscience clear. Dr. Finch sat his horse with the same professional composure he always maintained, but there was something different in his eyes, now a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Gentlemen," Elias said calmly, "I believe you'll want to see something before you arrest me." "The only thing I want to see is you in handcuffs," Sheriff Brody growled. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Digging up a grave, desecrating. She's alive." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Dr. Finch's face went very still, very careful, while Sheriff Brody's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What did you say?" the sheriff asked. "My wife is alive," Elias repeated, his voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "She's in the house right now, conscious and breathing. Dr. Finch buried her alive." The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Sheriff Brody's head snapped toward the doctor, whose composed mask was finally beginning to crack. "That's impossible," Dr. Finch said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I examined her myself. She was dead." "Then you won't mind examining her again," Elias said. "Unless, of course, you already know what you'll find." For a moment, the three men stared at each other in silence. Then Dr. Finch dismounted from his horse with careful, deliberate movements. His medical bag was in his hand, but Elias noticed that his other hand rested on the pistol at his hip. "Show me," the doctor said. They walked into the house together, Sheriff Brody's hand also resting on his weapon. The bedroom was warm and bright with morning sunlight, and in the center of it all lay Ilara, propped up on pillows and sipping carefully from a cup of warm broth. Her eyes met Dr. Finch's across the room, and in them was a knowledge that made the doctor take an involuntary step backward. "Hello, doctor," she said, her voice still weak but perfectly clear. "Thank you for the tonic. It gave me the most interesting dreams." Sheriff Brody's gun was out of its holster before Dr. Finch could draw his own weapon. The doctor's shoulders sagged in defeat as the full weight of his exposure settled over him. "How?" was all he said. "Monkshood," Ilara replied, holding up the pressed flower from her journal. "A fascinating plant. In large doses, it causes death. In smaller, carefully measured doses administered over several days, it can create a state of paralysis so complete that even a trained physician might mistake it for death, especially if that physician is looking for exactly that result." Dr. Finch said nothing, but his silence was confession enough. "The question is why," Sheriff Brody said, his gun never wavering. "Why would you do such a thing?" Ilara's laugh was weak but bitter. "Ask him about his gambling debts, Sheriff. Ask him about the money he owes to certain unsavory individuals in Denver. Ask him about the life insurance policy he convinced my husband to purchase just 6 months ago." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Dr. Finch, the respected physician, had been slowly poisoning Ilara while treating her supposed illness. When the paralysis was complete, he'd pronounced her dead and arranged for a quick burial, counting on the poison to finish what he'd started. The insurance money would have been more than enough to pay his debts and leave him wealthy besides. He'd counted on everything except the loyalty of a horse who refused to accept that her mistress was gone. As Sheriff Brody led Dr. Finch away in handcuffs, Elias sat beside his wife's bed and held her hand. Through the window, he could see Willow grazing peacefully in the pasture, her vigil finally ended. "How did you know?" Ilara asked, her voice growing stronger with each passing hour. "How did you know to dig me up?" Elias looked out at the horse, who had saved them both. "Willow told me," he said simply. "She knew you were still down there. She never stopped trying to get to you." Ilara followed his gaze and smiled. "She always was the smartest horse I ever knew." In the days that followed, as Ilara slowly recovered from her ordeal and Dr. Finch awaited trial for attempted murder, the story spread throughout the county and beyond. Some called it a miracle, others a testament to the bond between a woman and her horse. Elias called it simpler than that. It was love, pure and simple. Love that refused to accept defeat, even in the face of death itself. The nightmares would continue for months. Afterward, dreams of coffin lids and shallow breathing, of earth falling on helpless faces and desperate scratching in the dark. But they faded eventually, replaced by the simple joy of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of hands that found each other in sleep, of a horse grazing peacefully outside their window. Some nights, when the wind was right, Elias could swear he heard the sound of hooves on earth, patient and persistent and utterly determined. But when he looked outside, Willow was always exactly where she should be, safe in her pasture, no longer digging toward the impossible. She had found what she was looking for and brought her home. The grave in Willowbrook Cemetery remained empty, its headstone a monument to the day when death was cheated by the devotion of a horse who simply refused to give up. And in the house beyond the pasture, two people who had been given a second chance at life held each other close and whispered, promises they intended to keep.